It was evening in the little university town, the sun starting to set. He stood on the steps of the church waiting, a stack of bulletins in his hand, a hopeful look on his face. Mark Iaconelli had volunteered to lead a new prayer service at his church. It was going to be a contemplative service for students from the university located just across the street. And Iaconelli is a pretty good choice for this. He's written extensively on ministry with young people. He's a spiritual director, a faithful and funny writer whose books I happen to like a lot. In short, about as qualified as they come. He had planned and prepared for the service. He had collected smooth stones from a river and built a wooden cross and gathered candles and icons. He had given the service the attractively ambiguous name Thirst and advertised the event and spoken with students and trained musicians, and after 2 months of planning and laying the groundwork, the day had arrived. He opened the sanctuary doors and he stood there, bulletins in hand, watching and waiting. He narrates the scene this way. Immediately, I saw a group of 15 students walk across the street from the university. I smiled with warmth and gratitude as the students stepped onto the sidewalk in front of the church. They looked at me, a young woman waved, and then they turned and walked to the nearby grocery store. That's how it went. No one came to the service. It was just him, the musicians, the pastor, and the 3 kind elderly women from the parish who had come to make a dinner for all the prospective worshipers. And the trouble didn't stop there. They went ahead with the service, and the evening devolved into this comedy of errors with the 3 women stuck on the floor with arthritic knees after bending down to pray at the cross on the floor. Not exactly the contemplative experience Iaconelli had in mind. Not exactly a success. And after 9 months of weekly services across the street from the university, not a single student came. I think anybody who has been in church work for long has a story, or maybe 10 like this. It always makes me feel better, though, to hear about a failure from someone as qualified as Mark Iaconelli. I thought of this story this week when I read Jesus' words in our gospel reading. For which of you, intending to build a tower, does not first sit down and estimate the cost to see whether he has enough to complete it? It's a tiny parable about preparation, about sitting down and figuring out what's required for a given job. It's about making calculations ahead of time instead of just launching in without taking an idea of what it's going to cost. We can picture a building manager drawing up some blueprints, making measurements, itemizing the number of stones needed, calculating how many workers will have to be hired, and how many days' work the project will take. I thought of Iaconelli's story because all his careful preparation sounded quite a lot like the work of the building manager lifted up as an example in Jesus' parable. I also thought of his story because it bears some resemblance to an experience that our community had not so long ago. 2 Lents ago, we focused our worship around the image of the wilderness and the experience of refugees forced into wilderness places. Worship was rich and meaningful that Lent, and many of us felt that the next step was to let our praying and our singing lead us into action. So we prayed about it and we talked about it, and we met with local agencies here working with refugees. We asked how we could be of help, and somewhere along the line, the idea emerged for the English Cafe. We'll open our doors once a week, we decided, and we'll have a common, welcoming space where refugees and migrants can simply come and be and practice their English if they want to. Lots of us got pretty jazzed about the idea, including me. We signed up volunteers and we designed posters and we held a training. The Gemeindeраum was absolutely bursting with people who wanted to help. I had visions of this thing really taking off, of our congregation becoming known as a safe and welcoming place for refugees here in Geneva. We alerted local organizations to our start date, we put out our sign, we opened the doors on the first Tuesday. And rarely did anyone come. Many of you volunteered with the project and know what that was like. It wasn't quite the circus that first prayer service was at Iaconelli's church, but there was some disappointment. As many weeks, nobody showed up over the 4 hours that the cafe was open. Coffee was steaming in the pot, homemade cakes were laid out, there was information over here for local agencies working with refugees, and rarely was any of it used. I would often stop downstairs during the cafe time, and I'd encourage the volunteers that, of course, anything new takes a long time to catch on, and I firmly believe that. But after 6 months of it not catching on, we decided to let the project go this last July. We counted the cost. We planned for the materials needed, we gathered the volunteers, we reserved the space, we spread the word, and it didn't work. So what do we do with that? Jesus invites his listeners to think about a building manager calculating the cost of a tower, or a king counting the cost of entering a battle. But of course, he's talking about a whole lot more than churches planning worship services or service programs. He's talking about the entire life of following him, the entire experience of being a disciple. And when you start to parse out just what he says that costs, it can definitely give you second thoughts about whether you want to be part of this whole enterprise. The way Luke sets this scene, Jesus is speaking to a large crowd of followers, presumably people who don't know him very well, but are intrigued by his message and his actions and want to learn more. And Jesus tells them point blank that following him means hating your family, carrying your own cross, and giving up all your possessions. That's the cost. Who wants to sign up? I kind of picture the disciples cringing at Jesus' words, these people who knew him a little better, maybe trying to soften the message to the people around them. He's not always this grumpy, Lots of the time he does talk about love and mercy. Sometimes he calls us sheep. That's kind of cute, right? You can hear this passage as Jesus having a grumpy day, practically chasing away would-be disciples with words about how hard this path is actually going to be. But I think Jesus is simply giving the hard truth about the spiritual life, that it is, in fact, always about giving something up. Yes, he's probably speaking in hyperbole here with intentionally strong, provocative language. I can't imagine Jesus is genuinely counseling people to hate their family and their own lives. But he means to get everyone's attention. Make no mistakes. Being a disciple will ask you to give up all kinds of things. So lay it all out on the table, like a building manager with his blueprints, your previously held sources of identity, your pursuit of security, your comfort, your wealth and possessions, whatever else it is you cling to. Following Jesus will cost you all of it. Are you ready for that? I can't think of many people ready to give a hearty, full-fledged yes to that answer. Peter comes to mind. Peter, who pledged to follow Jesus no matter what, and promised with every fiber of his being not to deny him. And we know what became of those good and noble intentions, of course. Because really, who can say with confidence that they're ready to follow when Jesus puts it this way? Who can count that cost and say they're ready to begin? I'm not sure. Certainly not me. So if we take Jesus seriously here, and I think we must, if we take him seriously when he says that following him will cost everything, that leaves me with just two options. Either throw up my hands and stop trying now, or try and fail and come back to that impossible demand and try again. And that second option is, in my opinion, what the Christian life actually looks like. We do our best to let Jesus take central place in our lives, to model his ways of self-giving love, to seek his kingdom far beyond our own security. We stumble along the path after Jesus, and the truth is, we fail. Sometimes we fall, sometimes we wander and end up an awfully long way off the path, or lose it altogether. In short, we fail. And how can we not, with how demanding Jesus can be, with just how much he can ask? But here's the thing. What if that is actually just part of what it means to be a disciple? Because the Christian life doesn't always look like success, if you define that by honor or recognition or money or prestige. In fact, it often doesn't. There's no way, I know, to call Carry Your Cross a success story. And Christian life looks like a cross. Sometimes like failure and disappointment, and always like giving something up. Our need for success, for admiration, for security, for knowing just where it is that we're going. It looks like giving all of that up for something incomparably better. The new life that comes from trusting wholly in God's steadfast love. Our failures are actually an inevitable part of following Jesus, and if we let them, they can be part of the way that our old self is crucified and a new one rises up, one that trusts less in ourselves and more in God. So what happens when you count the cost and you come up short? What happens when the tower just doesn't seem to work? I remember going down to the Gemeindeраum one day during that English Cafe project and seeing an absolutely beautiful scene. A couple of volunteers talking and listening intently with a couple of folks who had come off the street, while Ben played cards with a man who couldn't speak English, only Arabic. One person did start coming to the cafe regularly, and you can read more about him in the church newsletter that just came out. So even if the project didn't go just as we had hoped, God was present there in our disappointment. And we are now exploring other ways we can serve. You'll see there's a meeting happening this week. If we let it, this experience can be much more than a failure. We can let it teach us humility, patience, gentleness, which are actually, I imagine, things you need when working with refugees. It's what Yaconelli calls spiritual poverty, a certainty not in ourselves and our knowledge and our achievement and our success, but in God, who is faithful. That's the kind of life that Jesus calls us to, and we only get there if we take up his impossible call and fail and try again, ready to follow, ready to fall down and dust ourselves off, ready to carry the cross, ready to give up our certainties for the one whose love is certain. Amen.